subscribe. You can find out more about our podcast, about our videos, about our live events, and just about anything else related to us at climateone.org. You can also follow us along on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, all at Climate One. So about tonight's event, we're going to run just about an hour. For the first 45 minutes, you're going to be listening to a conversation between Greg and our guests. And around the 45-minute mark, we're going to give you guys an option to ask unscripted questions. You'll have a moment to make a line at the microphone at the back of the room there. And we ask you to please be respectful of other people in the room, because we usually have a lot of people with a lot of great questions, so keep it short. And Greg will be here to support you if you need help doing that. Anything else? I think we just need to make sure you have your phones turned to silent, but feel free to keep them out and tweet using hashtag ClimateOne or hashtag Let's Talk Climate. And that's about it. So we'll get started with a short video.
For over 10 years, we at Climate One have been engaging policymakers, influencers, entrepreneurs, and activists and scientists in broad, respectful, candid conversations about everything climate. Food, energy, water, technology, transportation, housing. We've had huge success bringing together people who think they're on opposite sides of issues. When they sit down and have a candid conversation, they often find common ground and the basis for real solutions. We're emotional beings. Thoughtful, inclusive conversations create the conditions in which the changes we want to see become possible. So I want to hear from you. When you talk about climate, how do you talk about it? More importantly, what do you want to be talking about? With whom? Join the conversation. Even make your own video. Invite your friends to join you. Let's talk climate. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for a very special evening and bound to be very informative. I'd like to begin today's conversation by acknowledging the Ohlone and Coast Miwok people who inhabited Bay Area lands for 10,000 years. We've been doing that for a while. You notice they did that on the Academy Awards last night. They did a land recognition. From the Commonwealth Club of California, this is Climate One, changing the conversation about energy, economy, and environment. I'm Greg Dalton. In 2007, I went to the Arctic on a global warming expedition with scientists and journalists aboard an icebreaker. Experiencing climate change at the top of the world changed my life, and when I returned, I created Climate One as a project of the Commonwealth Club. For the last 13 years, I've been interviewing leaders about how burning fossil fuels disrupts all of the systems around us, our food system, our water system, our ecosystems, our lifestyles, and our economy. Climate changes everything. Today, we're discussing big ideas for confronting the climate challenge. We have two high-energy and eminent thought leaders to guide us through the upside and downside of big change at high speed in technology, markets, regulation, culture, investment, politics, and more. Daniel Esty is Hillhouse Professor of Environmental Law and Policy at Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and Yale Law School. Green to Gold, the 2009 book he co-authored, shaped corporate sustainability and remains a seminal work in the field. He's editor of the new book, A Better Planet, 40 Ideas for a Sustainable Future. Andy Karsner served as Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewables under the second President Bush and is highly active as an energy investor and advisor. He's a senior strategist and space cowboy at X, Alphabet's Moonshot Factory, formerly known as Google X. Please give them a warm welcome to Climate One. Welcome to you both. Daniel Esty, 1992 is a seminal moment in the history of the climate narrative. You played a key role there. Tell us about the role that you played in sort of the UN Framework Convention that kind of started the whole international climate effort.
So I was part of the U.S. team that worked for a couple of years to bring together the kind of emerging sense that we needed to do something about climate change, building on the science that had been consolidated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it took several years with negotiations every 3 months for a couple of weeks at a shot to bring together an initial agreement, a framework convention, as we called it. And that was worked out in the spring of 1992 and then signed by presidents and prime ministers at the famous Rio Earth Summit in June of 1992. And that launched us on the mission we're on to try to respond to climate change. And frankly, it was the only thing we had in place in the United States for quite a number of years until the 2015 Paris Agreement.
And compare that approach, the idea of how the theory of change for how climate change would be addressed then and now.
So I think the view in 1992, and it was a broad consensus about people who were thinking about the problem of climate change, was that we needed top-down action. So national governments would set the framework, and really more than set the framework, tell people what to do. And we thought that, frankly, once there was the commitment in place and that people were all around the world arguing for action, we would make things happen. So I actually negotiated that agreement and then left government thinking I'd done the job. 20 years later, I kind of woke up and realized, wow, we haven't done it. And I think what I began to argue for going into the 2015 Paris conversation that's now produced the Paris Agreement was a recognition that presidents and prime ministers don't actually have their hands on the steering wheel of a lot of the elements of society that determine a society's carbon footprint. So we needed to build in a bottom-up strategy alongside top-down. Frankly, a national government approach alone is not enough, and in many ways not even the right place to start. So we now know that governors, mayors, corporate leaders, national leaders in all kinds of organizations have to be part of the conversation and frankly have to deliver in significant ways. And I think the core of the strategy in the 20th century broadly, and by the way, that's the theme of this book, the Better Planet book, is about thinking about how we did things in some ways very effectively in the 20th century, but now have to pivot and take advantage of opportunities that weren't here 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I think the other big learning is that the vision of the 20th century was command and control. The government would tell people not just what the target was, but sometimes what the specific technology that they had to deploy, company by company, industry by industry. And what that did was lock in answers, sometimes reasonably good ones, sometimes not so good, and it left us without a strategy that had much space for innovation. So I've become convinced, and that's my own essay in this new book, is around how important it is to structure our policy approach in a way that spurs innovation. And with innovation spurs investment and the flow of funds to these new approaches. And so I think we've learned a lot in the intervening now 3 decades since we first were putting together that original 1992 agreement, some of which is captured in the 2015 Paris Agreement. But there's more space for innovation, breakthroughs, and frankly, new approaches.
Andy Karsner, one of the stepping stones to the Paris Agreement was the Bali Roadmap. You were a key negotiator in that. So tell us your role in the Bali Roadmap and how that kind of went to Copenhagen and Paris.
Right. Well, first of all, Greg, thanks for having me back. The last time I was here, we was sitting with Tom Steyer. It was right after Paris. So you might run for president one day, Dan. And that would be good. Just make your billion first is all. But you'll recall we had those reflections on Paris, and I was sort of happy to say, okay, we're done. We turned the corner as a planet, and everyone except for one country or two, I think it was Saudi Arabia, Nicaragua, said this is in fact happening. And that, after 3 decades, represented progress. These COPs that people talk about, Conference of the Parties, were meant to be implementations of the work that Dan and Bill Riley and the Rio Summit produced way back then, to say, we have this framework convention, now let us implement. And it went awry at a famous one called Berlin a few years later, where the Chinese and the Indians succeeded in saying, we will never be a developed country. And that then got embedded into Kyoto. And there was a big split amongst the people in the Clinton administration and who were working for Vice President Gore, and you'll recall that Kyoto came back as meant to be the seminal implementation, and the Senate rejected it, I think 98-0, something like that.
They never even put it up for a
Well,
vote.
they did a straw poll.
They had something called the Byrd-Hagel Amendment, which before the president could even propose it, was put through that said, don't bring us a treaty
Yeah.
unless the developing countries have signed on.
So the net of it was fairly dead on arrival. Unfortunately, a young, naive governor with a Texas accent in a controversial election stepped into the White House and said, nope, it's deader than a doornail, or something good in Texan. We'd say stepped in dog doo-doo and back home. And my mentor, George Shultz, had said it wasn't that George W. Bush rejected Kyoto, it's that he rejected it with such flourish. And in fact, that's led us into this long polarized period of beginning to talk about what had been a scientific consensus across our country and the way that is Pluto a planet or not. We talked about these things in a sensible way. It led us into whose tribe are you in? Are you a believer? Are you a denier? Are you protecting the oil interest? Are you protecting the solar panel guys? We have gotten worse and worse and more polarized. But prior to that, when the lines were closest, when a consensus was last evident, as Pew's research would show, in 2007, 2008, we were able to rejoin the global consensus with the Bali Roadmap. That was the significance of it, was that after a 10-year hiatus and not being part of the global community, we rejoined. The United States took a leadership role. We created something called the Major Economies Meetings, which the Obama administration then took on, and Todd Stern and Jonathan Pershing did their work. Unfortunately, got detoured at Copenhagen, but it led to Paris. And then the question is, so now what? Everybody's in Madrid. The kids are rightfully impatient. They don't like an outdated UN process governing them with a 20th century thinking about top-down mechanisms that require 180 countries to all agree at once. They don't feel like we have another 3 decades to move. And to me, that's the importance of Dan's book, is taking experts and saying we are going to democratize the way people have access to problem solving and enable bottom-up solutions to accelerate at an unprecedented pace. Fundamentally, if I was taking away your book, that would be my takeaway.
And I would say, even beyond that, we don't wait for government. There are lots of ways to go forward ahead of certainly national governments, maybe even ahead of what city and state governments can do. And I think one of the steps forward of Paris was also to say we're not going to have everybody have the same standard. We're going to let people choose a goal, commit to a goal, and then have a diversity of ways to pursue that agenda and move things forward. And I think that's progress. People will say, well, it doesn't add up to enough, and that's true, but it does get everybody on the playing field. And of course, the big flaw of the original 1992 Framework Convention was that it only invited a subset of countries to actually commit to action. So the so-called Annex 1 list of countries, 40-something industrialized nations, and everybody else was asked to play if they wanted to, or they could sit on the sidelines, and almost everybody chose to sit on the sidelines.
Sure. Not a surprise there, and Paris includes everyone. Dan Esty, you think that there's a shift happening underground, behind closed doors in Republican political circles. Tell us, what's the evidence of that?
Well, I've myself been testifying before the Congress recently in the month of December, and was asked to sort of lay out a pathway that the country might follow. And of course, there's Democrats and Republicans in the conversation. And I won't tell you that the Republicans stood up and cheered during the testimony, but a number of them said, would you come back to my office later this afternoon and spend a little time with me thinking about what a Republican approach to this problem might look like? So I can tell you there are conversations going on. The minority leader in the House is convinced, being as he is from California, that the future of the party depends on having something to say about climate change. So Kevin McCarthy is on this team that's thinking about it. And frankly, I think you will see, not this year, not in 2020, but in 2021, a shift in the dynamic of this conversation. You will see Republicans coming back at climate change, and frankly, I think back at the sustainability agenda more broadly, with a recognition that from an electoral point of view, to just be against it all is not very viable over the long term.
Andy Karsner, I feel like I've heard this before. 2015, when Pope Francis came to Washington, D.C., there were 10 Republicans who then took what was a bold move. Chris Gibson, Republican of New York, and 10 Republicans came out of the closet on climate and said, we think something ought to happen on climate. Chris Gibson is now no longer in Congress. So we've been hearing for years about a prison break, Republicans going to come out, and yet with what we've seen with the party doing recently and a president who's vehemently opposed to climate, is that realistic to think that it's going to happen in 2021? 2020?
Not while this president's in office. You know, I've also testified on the Hill. I agree with what Dan has said. There are Republicans in Congress that it's not sort of, well, I totally understand the science now. I'm all with it. I just got caught up. Sorry about that, memory lapse, whatever. It really is closer to, look, the red states are getting pounded by hurricanes. We can no longer insure our homes. Our municipalities are going broke. We don't understand why water is in the street in Homestead, Florida. And we are out of reasons to protect the oil industry to figure out what to do because our votes are at count. So there's nothing that motivates in D.C. like fear, and fear is hitting the Hill because except for California and fires, almost every other immediate impact of climate change is happening in a red state.
And suburban districts who are key to the electoral strategy.
Absolutely. And so that I separate that from the question of executive and administrative leadership. This president, this issue is hopeless. There is not, you can invite Gore to the office and, have Ivana roll out some ideas of some other soft meetings. But the reality is this, when Bush was the Antichrist and eats his children and wanted to destroy the world, back in that day of mythology, it was a difference of opinion. It was simply, we would like to do it this way, as opposed to that way. It wasn't, this doesn't exist, it's a hoax. The Chinese are trying to take our jobs. This president lives in a different place. And more important than this president, as with any administration, he's only the face of a franchise. The real question is, who's the team beyond the sort of, nepotism and mafioso he's got himself surrounded with? The real question is, who is capable, competent, has the acumen, experience, relevance, diplomacy to execute anything in those jobs? And the answer almost across the board is, I don't know. Nobody really knows who these people are. And I know the guy who sits in my office managing the $2 billion applied science portfolio for the federal government in our national labs is the guy who wrote a book about how all this stuff is a waste of money and fraud and abuse. So this is a particularly ideological bent gang of folks. And
Are you still a Republican?
What a good question. I'm a Bill Riley, George Shultz, Ronald Reagan Republican, to be sure. I am a Republican from the party of Lincoln. There is nothing that this con man and Abraham Lincoln have in common.
So Andy, one other thing though, I would say,
don't get me letting you how I really feel. Just don't send me there.
We're just getting warmed up here, Andy.
so I think what I see happening is what you just suggested, but went by very quickly. So I want to come back and focus on it. And that is what I see now is that the folks that were saying it's all a hoax are of two groups. One who are staying with it and others who are saying, that was never really the problem. The problem was the policy framework that our Democratic friends wanted to put out or the environmental community wanted us to follow. And if you can tell us that there are other ways to achieve these goals, ones that are more focused on harnessing business innovation, finding ways to engage people in breakthrough thinking, and get beyond the sense that the answers are all going to be more government programs, more dictates from government, more mandates, more command and control regulation, then we want to have a conversation.
Right.
And frankly, that's what I think the Better Planet book is about. Let's get beyond the debates of the past and look forward and dig into the substance. And as I talk about this book out across the country, I see an enormous desire to get into the substance, get beyond that tough politics, and start to move forward.
One footnote here, though, is that in 2006, Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger signed into the first major piece of climate legislation in the country, and it was a market-based solution, cap and trade, because the Republicans wanted market-based solutions, didn't want command and control. Cap and trade gets into the law of the land in California, and then a bunch of companies and people on the right saying, "Oh, it's messy, it's too unpredictable." I'm like, wait a minute, you're the ones who wanted the market-based solution in the first place. Then it gets passed, and then they're all they're against it. Fairness?
They want to game it, but I think I think it's, and that's chronic. That doesn't actually matter what rule set it is. That's what people send lobbyists to these capitals to do, is try to game it to their advantage. But the more fundamental question is, and the Democrats are going to have to grapple with this, with Bernie leading in the polls for them, is do you or do you not believe a solution can be had that is not a market-based solution. I sort of stand with, we already won the 20th century. Socialism is a failed philosophy as much as Trump's neo-fascism is a failed philosophy. We beat down these things to become sensible global players and hold up a beacon of what free enterprise, fungible markets, the movement of people, and liberty could mean in the world, okay? It's our choice to retrench from that, and it's a bad choice because the world doesn't actually have a good alternative. But more fundamentally, is that we cannot solve this in a time frame that is relevant without using market forces. Those market forces are asymmetrical to government, any government's power to arrest. So you have got to turn the market by addressing its imperfections, account for what we currently call externalities, bring them into the balance sheet, and have our business actors incorporate them into their thinking. That's what's going on in Scandinavia. That's what's going on in other parts of the world where people are winning at a rate that's consequential. And if given the opportunity here in a policy environment, that's what will happen here.
Dan Esty, the Democratic candidates for president, Bernie's way out there with 17 trillions. There's like lots of trillions. The Green New Deal, is it going too far? Does it risk?
I think the Democrats have got a conversation going about the path forward, and there's a range of views, and I think that's good. And so I think the energy of the Green New Deal is to be celebrated. The fact that you've got people motivated in a conversation, and again, debating the path forward. That's the debate I'm willing to have. And I think, credit to the Green New Deal of making sure everybody talks about this now.
We had Carlos Curbelo, Republican of Florida, here saying the Green New Deal, I don't agree with it, but it got people talking.
And I agree with that. And I would tell you 4 years ago, this issue didn't get much debate at all. Climate change broadly, the environment even more specifically. So we do need someone to energize the debate, and I think we're getting there. And I would say that, Andy has teed up something I hope we'll come back to, because one of the big ideas that I'm pushing personally and is in this book in a number of places is what I call the end of externalities. Now, that's a little bit of jargon, using term an economist would, but it basically says that the old business model, which had companies putting emissions up a smokestack or out an effluent pipeline, and in effect putting a cost that they might have been asked to bear onto the society as a whole, isn't going to go in the years ahead. And increasingly, we're going to ask people to take account of the harm they're causing, and, by the way, the resources they're extracting from public spaces, whether that's water or land that they're using for timber. And basically, it's not that we're going to end all pollution or end extraction of resources, but you're going to be expected to pay for it.
Polluters pay, that's the thing. Thomas Rashad Easley is Assistant Dean of Community and Inclusion at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He raps under the name Rashad Ease, and he's coined a term called Hiphop Forestry to describe what he does.
I'm a part of two. I'm a part of two communities that, in my opinion, don't come together pretty often, and that's hip-hop and then that's forestry.
This hip-hop forestry and poetry is getting late, let's flow a tree. This academic superstar gonna plant a seed and grow a tree. In my front yard, locally, on my block, hopefully, make others do it, globally, not fresh air, I'm thankful for oxygen, a tree hugging out again, but trees my family, you see I lost a lot of friends. Humans,
I don't talk about climate change only in terms of forestry, I talk about it in my music, I talk about it in my poetry. I go to places with people who are just like me in some regard, and then at the same time or at different times, I go to places where people are completely different than me. So I show up in those spaces and have those conversations where most of my colleagues don't even go. I do what my colleagues need to do if they really want to bring people into this discussion. You have to build a relationship first. You have to make the time to do that. You have to learn what they're going through. Then you start to talk to them about climate change, because you're talking to them about change and how it's impacting them.
we found Nemo in a contaminated stream near a landfill in my backyard near a swing set. Cancer can kill, but we play in brown fields surrounded by sound kills, sirens, horn shots, trains. It's all around here. I want to escape, but how far does the Uber go? Buses, wheelchairs are hard to navigate in Yellowstone.
I think it's a mistaken method is to take people out of their environments and take them on hikes and take them to forests and take them to mountains and different things like that, you know, and then just hope people will fall in love with it, you know. That's what the Forest Service did with me, and they've done it with a host of other people of color, you know, like let's give them a scholarship and then we'll just throw them out west somewhere. No, what you should do is you should show people the beauty at home. Show them how they exist or help them understand their existence in their home places. Even though I was in the biggest city in the state of Alabama, I grew up gardening with my grandparents.
Traditions, Hiphop Forestry. Our trees are not a commodity. They teach us, show us how to live on troubled land and harmony. This Hiphop Forestry. Because both roads from underground, one change landscape, the other change the landscape of sound. This Hiphop Forestry. We not scared when people or bugs approach us. We don't just worry about POs, we worry about COs. This Hiphop Forestry. Emissions, we don't do carbon.
If you don't know how to communicate with people, then that means you're also part of the problem. So regardless if you want to change, save the planet or not, if you can't talk to the people who are cohabitating with you on this planet, then you're not really helping the situation at all. You're actually also making it worse.
What you didn't create, hip-hop. Respect life, because life is the value. Listen, discuss, and problem solve, and then we add you. Forestry, hip-hop. Inclusion ain't just about solutions. In food and water and religion, we remove pollution. This for hip-hop. Every complexion is worth protection.
That was Dr. Thomas Rashad. Yeah. Dr. Thomas Rashad Easley, Assistant Dean of Community and Inclusion at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. The music you heard was his song, Hiphop Forestry. Dan Esty, first of all, pretty cool that the school has such a dean, and address the idea there, because addressing him crossing that race and class divide. You don't throw people of color into nature and say, here, love it. You got to bring it to them.
Well, first of all, it's a joy to have his essay in this collection. And as the editor of a book with 40 essays, I am not allowed to have a favorite, just as no parent can have a favorite child. But I have to say this one is particularly exciting to me because I think it goes to an issue that has been under the surface and yet critical. And that is, how do you build an environmental coalition that it can obtain a majority support for some of the things we all now would say need to be done? And I think as long as the conversation was all conducted in the language of upper middle class suburban white folks, you were going to leave a lot of people out of it. And so Thomas is drawing on and bringing into the discussion folks who never would have been part of it. And so I'm thrilled to see that. And I think what he's saying is a pretty profound message, and that is you've got to go to people on their terms, not make them come to you on your terms. And I would argue that there's even a deeper message there, and that is we are going to have to respond to a whole set of communities who are doubtful that their life is going to be better in a sustainable future, better as we address climate change. And I think we have been systematically under-attending in the environmental arena broadly to transition strategies. How do you help people who are worried about change, doubtful that they're going to survive the kind of charges that Andy and I want to make people pay for the harm they're causing, the internalizing of these externalities. And I think this has got to be part of the conversation.
Andy Karsner, yeah, there's a concern, the term just transition, that the people who are harmed and left behind in a fossil fuel economy are left behind in a green economy that just serves coastal elites and people who can afford it. Is that fair?
Yeah. I think we're seeing it right now. I think we're seeing it, and even in the most progressive places like California, we don't actually have a good handle on the governance or design to manage the just transition that we would desire. I mean, fundamentally, most of the things that exist in our commons, if they're natural commons, the harm is going to affect us equitably. Therefore, the participation, the stakeholding in trying to solve for the harms needs to be accessed equitably. We haven't designed that as yet, and that's why somebody in Palo Alto can pump sunshine into their Tesla with no and earn a tax credit for their Tesla, as if they weren't going to buy a $100,000 car if they didn't have a $7,000 tax credit, and they can avoid road taxes, avoid gas taxes, avoid everything else, leaving that for people who that $7,000 credit won't even cover bus fare for a year of commuting. So we have massive inequities being induced, even as we're seeking to catalyze a green economy. Nothing worse than what is happening right now with the wildfires. That, fundamentally, we have a situation where, unbeknownst to Californians, people are mapping where the lights go out. And when they map where the lights go out, and the fact that California is defaulting on a 100-year promise of a social compact to deliver a just, equitable, on-time, reliable, on-demand power supply, even before it's a revised social compact and made green. We're defaulting on the original one that allowed for these monopolies to take place. So what's happening is people's property values are getting hit. Those property values get hit, the tax base goes down. The property values get hit, the tax base goes down, they become uninsurable properties. These things are cascading through California, and meanwhile, we have a utility that's in bankruptcy just seeking how to service its equity investors. I mean, we have a real conundrum, and that's in the most progressive state. That's before you get to states that aren't thinking about the transition at all. So this dislocation being caused economically is something very real and requires us to be proactive in design in the same way that FDR or TR, that Teddy was proactive in design. And this is a Teddy Roosevelt moment.
So, Greg, let me just jump in on that, because I think there's, in the spirit of driving this conversation to the specifics that we need to take seriously, and I would encourage this audience that probably cares about determining and delivering and supporting this transition to a clean energy future, to a real response to climate change. So 3 communities. One are the folks whose budgets are already so tight, the prospect of paying more for the harm they're causing, the fossil fuels they're burning, is a big shock to them. So I think we have to have a strategy for the lowest income bracket. Second of all, we have to have a strategy for the parts of the country that are fossil fuel dependent and not well positioned to transition. And that's sometimes now called the West Virginia problem. And it's got to be taken seriously. And then third, and I think this is the piece that's the silent part of the story, but critical, is that it turns out that rural people are much more energy intensive than city people. And so if we're going to have a transition, I think one of the things we need to pay attention to is, if we collect the money of these harm charges that I'm calling for, that I think there's growing momentum for, I think we have to redistribute that money, not per capita, not to every person, but I think we should send it to the states. And we should send it to the states with a kicker supporting extra payments to the states with the poor people that are most affected, the fossil fuel communities that are going to be jarred, and to the rural communities that are going to have to re-gear themselves. And I think that would go a long way to help build the political momentum to get over the hurdle and get something done.
That sounds like the rural states, though, are the red states, and the urban states are the blue states. So is that a blue-red wealth distribution strategy?
My view is you're going to have to get a political coalition built here. And the folks that are hesitating today are red state elected officials. And you're going to have to develop a strategy to get them on board.
So that's a yes. Yes, we're going to. There's these blue states, California and New York, and are going to have to figure out a way that people are benefiting from climate transitions across the center of the country. You're not ever going to get them to join a national coalition by saying, if only you had as much access to education, resources, tech companies, and wealth as we had, you'd be as educated and you wouldn't be ruining my life. That is not a winning argument politically, okay? So you've actually got to go with the generous outreach of my fellow Americans. How do we rise together, okay? And not demonize you for your history in the ag belt or the iron belt or the energy belt. How do we rise together in a transformation that we must have at the fastest possible pace?
And Dan Esty, it's been quite a while since we've seen a grand bipartisan bargain in this country. Maybe there's recently some deal on criminal justice sentencing. There's been a few of them, but since the days of McCain-Feingold, grand bargains, is that still possible in today's divided politics? And is it necessary to get real action on climate that goes across handoffs between Republicans and Democrats? Because this climate policy has to endure handoff, change of power.
So let's start with the necessary. I think it's essential. And I'm going to offer something that's truly counterintuitive. Transformative change does not come from the extremes. It comes up the middle. Because what makes it transformative is not that it happens for a moment, but that it endures. That it's around 5 and 10 years later after the political pendulum swings. And frankly, the last major piece of environmental legislation, I would argue, is the 1990 Clean Air Act. And I'd like to test the students at Yale on what they think the final vote in the United States Senate was on the 1990 Clean Air Act. I see at least one person in the room who probably knows the answer to that, and we won't let Bob Grady provide the answer here. But the answer, and
just to clarify, this is the first President Bush in the White House.
First President Bush in the White House. So we have a Democratic Congress, President is Republican. We are coming together on a bipartisan basis, and the B students at Yale, who've never experienced anything other than political division of the deepest sort, are sure that it was 51-49. The A students say, oh, no, it takes 60 votes to clear the threat of filibuster in the Senate. It was probably 60-40. The answer was 89-11. And it was a moment where, by the way, and having been there working on this issue, again, with a broad team, we lost equal numbers, 6 and 7, or 5 and 6 off Democratic and Republican side. So it was truly bipartisan. And what that meant was that as we began to roll it out and implement it, and by the way, it's still being implemented, it's not fully done, but over the next decade, both Republicans and Democrats came together to fix the little mistakes that were built in. And anytime you take on transformative change, in this case, we're redoing the kind of foundations of industry in America, and the next change that we're talking about is relaying the energy foundations of society, you will get things wrong. And if you've done it on a partisan basis, as soon as the other guys take power, they're going to say, look at how these guys screwed it all up. Let's undo what they did and just pull it back. So I think necessary, absolutely. Now, your second question was, is it possible? And I think that's a harder question. Not, I think, in the current political moment. I have no hope that in the coming year we'll see anything. But I think in the not too distant future, there is a prospect. But it is only a prospect if we get to what I sometimes call the radical centrist solution, which is radical in that it's going to be transformative, but it has an ability to attract a broad base of political support. My core number is 70% support. You can't do it if you've got a deeply angry, defeated side of the spectrum.
Andy Karsner, that's actually happened in California. We've had that consistency across Republican and Democratic administrations. I see that happening in this. I see very little chance of that in Washington. A lot of chances of that happening at the state. So talk about, most of the energy that goes into American homes and businesses are regulated at the state and regional level. There is state action that is crossing the party lines, like Dan said, just not in Washington.
Well, I'm gonna go there. I'm not gonna avoid that, but I've got to correct Dan for the record because I told him earlier that that energy legislation always has environmental consequence, and environmental legislation always has energy consequence. So I would say the last bipartisan omnibus comprehensive legislation was the 2007 Energy and Independent Security Act. And you'd say, well, that was just energy. Well, maybe, except for that it phased out incandescent lighting, and it gave the federal government a standard of 30% emissions reduction, gave us a renewable fuel standard, created bins in our vehicle mileage that the Obama administration used to incorporate electric vehicles and so forth. And it gave us 10-year runway on the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, et cetera. The common characteristic of both of those, and they shouldn't be 15 and 17 years apart. Now we're 15 years past that, or that it shouldn't be that, because we should be having a dynamic, adaptive legislative leadership that is sufficiently attuned to the capacities of society and all the sectors of society and technology, finance, NGOs, et cetera, that it is regularly modifying itself in an adaptive way to stay ahead of the curve. But we wait for these 15-year things. In our case, it was $147 oil and 2 big hurricanes that allowed us to do it, okay? We can't wait for that. But what Dan's stressing, that is absolutely correct, is that our aspiration in that legislation was not arm twisting the 51st vote and cutting a special deal. It was not finding how to wait for the next election and have our party lead. It was accepting that Nancy Pelosi's party was running the House, and even with a different party in the Senate, we could build the coalitions for 2/3 majorities on both sides, because the goal was to be judiciary proof and to provide investors, entrepreneurs, innovators, farmers, society at large with a predictable signal and runway that was durable with sufficient longevity to make real change. And that's what's happened in the last decade. But we need a refresh, because we didn't legislate for artificial intelligence, machine learning, the Internet of Things, cloud compute, and sensors. We didn't have all that. And so Washington, again, has got to get attuned. you're right that they're not leading, they're lagging. And if you're going to find the leadership, you're going to find it amongst these governors who care first and foremost about economic development and the safety and security of their citizens. So even in some of these red states, North Carolina and others, you're finding very aggressive push-outs to say, how do I get that new manufacturing base here? How do I stimulate that economic activity? What happened right in California? How do we bring it to New Mexico? We have 13 states right now that have already that have followed California's zero-emission 2045 mandate. So that's happening like wildfire, right? And so we've got to take very seriously the learning laboratories of the states, because that is, in fact, where the leadership is occurring, because they're much more attuned to the economic development locally.
And I would say...
Oh, thank you.
And
My dad.
I would say that we've got lots of evidence that governors are getting things done. And frankly, they can be done on a bipartisan basis that holds together as party leadership changes. In Connecticut, I worked to set up the first in the nation green bank to ramp up the flow of private capital using limited government money to leverage those funds to really take energy efficiency to scale, renewable power to scale in a way that couldn't be done with a limited government money. And that package came together and ended up getting not just Democratic majority, but got every single state senator in the whole state of Connecticut, 36 out of 36, every Republican as well as every Democrat. And out of 151 state representatives, all but 5 voted yes. And of the 5 that voted yes, voted no, those 5 that voted no, 3 of them later said, oh, I meant to vote yes, it was late at night, I didn't know what button to press. And so it turns out when you actually drive something to conclusion, it's going to work, and it has worked. It's scaled up the flow of energy, of money to energy efficiency and renewable power dramatically. And you're getting $7 of private capital for every $1 of government money in the system. Everyone's in favor of it. But that's where I think the answer to why we need to move forward is in this idea that you can be bipartisan. You can get people to come together with the right policy framework.
Monica Medina is a former official with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, which oversees the National Weather Service. With extreme events rising, she says the federal government should create a new service that recognizes the difference between weather and climate.
Climate is what you expect, and weather is what you get. So the difference is climate is thinking long term, what are the average temperatures, what is it usually like outside this time of year, and then weather is actually what you get. And right now we have a fantastic group of public servants who do their best to predict the weather, including the most extreme weather events that we've seen in recent years. But they are not really set up to do the kind of seasonal, interannual, and targeted forecasts we're going to need for the climate changes that we're going to be experiencing in the future. Things that would help farmers or the insurance industry or just average folks get ready for the climate in the months, weeks, and years ahead. We need to create a national climate service within the National Weather Service in order to better prepare us for the strong storms, all the environmental changes we're going to be experiencing during climate change, from droughts to sea level rise to storm surge, hurricanes, fire. We need more data. We need more supercomputer time to crunch the data, and we need then the scientists to work on products that will help people. Right now, we have small climate service offices scattered around the country. It's dozens of people, not the thousands that we probably need. Lots of people have talked about the need for this service. In fact, NOAA has studied it extensively and had come up with lots of options that we were considering at the beginning of the Obama administration. And we just never were able to get the funding from Congress. So there's a lot of study about how we save money by adapting and by preparing, but it's more than just having emergency response ready. It is how do we change where we build things, what we build, the way we build them, where we develop, where we don't, how we create natural ways to defend ourselves. But without the kind of climate forecasting that we need, we won't know where to do it.
Monica Medina held senior positions at NOAA under President Obama and President Clinton. Dan Esty, she wrote a chapter in your book. It seems like if we can't get something so basic and nonpartisan as, there's a joke going around, we don't need the National Weather Service, we have the Weather Channel. Well, where do you think the Weather Channel gets the data, right?
It's beyond belief that people could offer that, but it tells you the kind of moment we're in. And frankly, it's even worse. There's kind of a hostility to expertise, to science, to data, to analysis. But this book, by the way, is not written for today or this year. It's written for a 10-year agenda. And frankly, the importance of good data to ground your decision-making on is irrefutable. And so I think Monica's argument is essentially correct. And I think people are going to come to appreciate it. And I think more broadly, there is a moment coming where we're going to go back to science as critical to decision-making, not just in the environmental arena or energy arena, but broadly. And frankly, the expertise is a good, not a bad thing.
Andy Karsner, there was a company, actually some ex-Googlers came out and formed something called the Climate Corporation, which was using scientific data to look at crop risk, that sort of thing. It was eventually bought by Monsanto. This raises the question for me whether corporations will fill a void left by government not really doing the job that it used to do. And what does that mean when profit-driven companies kind of are in charge of some of the data that used to be provided as a public good by government?
Well, I'm not fearful that private companies are availing data. I mean, I think that we have a revolution in data that is so great, it's hard to contemplate how much infrastructure is built when my daughter accidentally holds the iPhone and hits 26 different pictures, and how that goes to 4 different data centers in 7 different states and is backed up by Amazon, and that's if you're not a Google supplier, if you're not on Picasa, et cetera. So data is here. We have data abundance. We might even have data excess. What we have is a deficiency of data distillation that can yield the relevant insights in a timely manner that can shift the way we think about capitalism, that can shift our imaginations so that we have new indicators to trade upon, because fundamentally this is all about a trade in risk management. If it's Monsanto, it's about what is the crop yield. If it's an insurance company, it's about what's the probability of a storm or the actuarial life of a property relative to whether it's in a fire zone. If it's Larry Fink at BlackRock, it's about what's the real property asset value of all these shopping malls that I own and how close to the seashore are they, et cetera. No matter where you are, no matter what you do, climate change risk is coming in some gradient or form. And for some of us, it's coming much faster. We need that data to get over the legacy antiquated models, which are statistically erroneous because they are all looking at the rearview mirror, trying to extrapolate empiricism. Empiricism won't work where we're going. We have to have stochastic dynamic modeling that's informed by this data that's distilled appropriately, and then you apply machine learning and artificial intelligence to think faster. Right? The machines, we've crossed the lines. The machines that have come out of this Bay Area and are all over the world think faster, they process better, it's never going to change again. What they can't do is think higher or feel more deeply. And so we have got to have that human spirit to have sufficient empathy and understand the real damage that is occurring in real people's lives right now and apply that with deliberative design. Thanks, Dad. Yeah. I think my cousins are here somewhere, too. Thanks.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about Climate One today, about risk and big ideas in climate change. I'm Greg Dalton. My guests are Dan Esty, professor at Yale School of Forestry and Law. He's editor of the new book, A Better Planet, 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. And Andy Karsner is a former official in the Department of Energy under the second President Bush and a space cowboy at X, the Moonshot Factory affiliated with Google. Dan Esty, you've written a lot about corporate motivations. Recently, we've seen the Business Roundtable come out and say we need to kind of tinker with capitalism a bit, not sort of challenging shareholder primacy. Larry Fink, Andy just mentioned, talking about risk. And recently, one that caught my eye was Jim Cramer, that got madman ranting on CNBC, said, I'm done with fossil fuels. I'm just done because there's a generational change. Is this happening out of fear? And is this for real, or is this greenwashing?
Well, I think it's a little both. And I think one of the things that we need to be able to do, and maybe Andy's crew at Google can help us with this, is to get the metrics, get the data that allows us to separate the greenwash and the folks blowing smoke from the ones that are really leading to a substantial change in how they do business, and in doing so, perhaps guiding us towards a sustainable future. And so I'm a big believer that we should get a better grip on which companies are out there doing what. There's a big push now for better environmental, social, and governance metrics. You'll see the acronym ESG. And a lot of investors are saying now, I want better alignment between my portfolios and my values. And so, Larry Fink at BlackRock, if I'm putting my money into one of your funds, I need you to tell me that I am actually in alignment. And I think Larry Fink has started to say, well, we're going to get you there. I think we can still ask, is he really doing that? And not yet would be my answer. And I think the Business Roundtable has said something important. I think they have said that the old Milton Friedman model, that it's all about delivering shareholder value, is not enough. 21st century, you have to have a stakeholder model that says, yes, profitability still matters, delivering for shareholders is still a big deal, but you need to think about your customers, your suppliers, your employees, your communities, and those are part of what it takes to be a responsible company in the 21st century.
So the Business Roundtable, JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon there, Chase says they support climate. They also have loaned about $400 billion for fossil fuel infrastructure. Help me understand both of those things.
I think you got to get people to follow through on their commitments. And I think, saying the right thing is a start. And then we should hold people's feet to the fire. And I think, that's the role of folks like you and the journalists in the world, is to say, really, you made this big pronouncement. Where's the proof?
Where's the price for the companies, though? They don't pay any price, Andy.
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to tie back and just complete your question about the data and the private companies. And the reason it comes to my mind that there's a great company based just down the road here in San Francisco called Planet. It used to be called Planet Labs. In the paradigm where the government is exclusively responsible, NASA's been arguing for several decades for a couple satellites that were quite important, but then got canceled and then got put back in the budget, and you sort of lose time. And here's a couple of guys who spun off their career out of NASA and said, look, we want to not just look out at the stars, we want to look back at the Earth, because this is the most important celestial body, is the one that we live on. And so they launched constellations of these things. Maybe 20 satellites would fit on the stage at very low cost with very high optics. And they're working tightly with Conservation International, Environmental Defense Fund, and all these other things. The government can't move that fast, doesn't have that level of innovation within it. So government's got to concentrate on taking itself out of exclusivity or supremacy and focusing on where it is indispensable to provide parameters and guidance to let these trends exist. Your question now was
reforming capitalism,
yes.
Or sort of we have this
Yes.
corporate-driven capitalism.
Yeah.
Are we going to kind of tinker with it,
Yeah.
or does it need to be dramatically changed to rise to the climate?
So I'm a big fan of markets, and I'm saddened that our world has changed into, are you for a market or against a market? I actually think it's very much a natural condition, and we as humans have the opportunity in our collective communities to impose rules on the market for the market to serve us. But some people are very purist about this. You have this libertarian friend, Peter Thiel, who will tell you the market always works by itself, don't touch it. And in this case, the market solving for climate change, I would say he's right. The market will work.
Even though climate is a market failure.
The market will work if you're trying to solve for climate change. The market will eliminate humans, and if that happens, you will probably return to equilibrium. Okay, but that's not a market response I would like to have. I think one has to account for time and for impact. Okay, and so to act within a time frame that's consequential and not the time frame the market gives you or the consequence the market gives you, we need intelligent design. And that means healing the market imperfections of not accounting for these externalities that Dan spoke of.
Changing the rules of the markets, not doing away with markets, just have better rules for the market.
Absolutely. We've got to turn that capital formation to solutions to construction instead of destruction.
Dan Esty.
Most people would say that there are market failures. There's a very small number that say it's so little that you don't want to pay attention, Or worse yet, they say that's something called the nirvana fallacy, which is if you intervene, you'll mess things up more, so just don't play. I think we know that's not right. I think we know that markets have to be shaped by rules. And for most people, the question is, what are those rules? And I would say, this is one of the undercurrents of our conversation tonight, that the original environmental framework, which is also the energy framework, as Andy points out, was designed in the 1970s in a world that was information poor. We're now in an information-rich world. And one of the things that we can do differently today is track those harms and make people pay for them. And at very low cost, very low tracking burden. And I think if you make people pay, they start to pay attention. And if they pay attention, they move actually more often, more quickly than you can imagine to change their behavior, and people come in with innovations to help them change. So the state of Connecticut, where I live, on the 1st of August, put in a tax on plastic bags. 10 cents a bag. The number of families that economics are changed, not many. Reduction in plastic bag use since August when this was put in, 80%. So it turns out you can actually dramatically shift not just behavior, but people's thinking. Because it's not the 10-cent cost, although I'm one of these guys that gets to the front of the grocery line, realizes I left the bags in the car, and I go running outside, not because I can't afford to pay 10 cents or 40 cents for 4 bags, but because it's a reminder to me that there's a sustainability issue here that I should internalize.
There'll be students there snapping photos of you if you walk out of the grocery store with plastic bags, that's for sure.
And that's part of the information revolution, too. Everybody is today a watchdog.
Accountability. I had the great privilege of working with the visionary designer, Tony Fadell, who at the time that we were evolving Nest thermostat. And if you'd asked me back when in my career, going from power plants to thermostats, if I thought that would be my business, I would have said, no, not at all. But here's this brilliant guy who was responsible for iPhones and iPods, and he wants to do, and he hates the Honeywell thermostat that's 90-year monopoly on his wall that you just hit 72 stay, and what is this other programming stuff? And he wants to turn it into a usefully aesthetic device and everything else, and cool. And my job is to think of how that applies to energy and everything on the back end that Tony doesn't really think about. And so going through that exercise all the while, which was sort of the tip of the spear for the Internet of Things. Before that, we weren't using that phrase, before this consumer device. And going through that, I sort of thought to myself, how could it be that we could devise a device with the same available sensors, cloud, compute, and even designed hardware for our man-made homes, for its care, comfort, and convenience, to control its ambiance, to manage our sphere, but we can't do it for our natural home? How could that be that we don't have an internet of natural things and we're still walking through the rainforest with bird warblers and journal books in a most romantic way with flap jackets and so forth? And so we actually have got to use the planet, the goodwill of founders from Planet. We've got to have things that fly, things that float, submersible things in space, to triangulate in a way with all these people who are in the field who can account for nature so that we can manage what we measure, and we can bring those measurements on board so that our natural home, the things that should be most secure, most valuable, most worthy of price discovery and human existence, that those things are brought into our market economy.
So tech will save us? So tech will save us?
Not by itself, no. But innovation is in our spirit. The mother necessity is calling, and it has got to have sufficient leadership and guidance to integrate in a time frame that matters. What will save us is sufficient conscientious leadership to do these things in the relevant time frame.
Dan Esty, do we need new technology or just to deploy the technology we have?
A little bit of both. And I would say, in fact, one of the curious things about the environmental arena is that it's more than almost any other part of society untouched by the breakthroughs of the last 3 or 4 decades, untouched by the information revolution. Every other segment of society I can imagine has been transformed. Baseball players don't pick the players today the way they did 30 years ago. When you had the scouts chewing tobacco and saying, yeah, that guy has it, that guy doesn't.
The Clint Eastwood character.
Well, and even the data that people track now is changed. It's not just batting average, it's on-base percentage. So data's transformed baseball, it's transformed every business and how they market. We've done very little to marry those technology breakthroughs to our environmental challenges.
We're going to going to go to our lightning round and ask a true or false question of each of our guests. So this is a one-word answer, true or false. Starting with Andy Karsner. While serving in the second Bush administration, you often talked about the promise of clean coal. True or false?
Me personally? I can't remember, but true, probably.
I heard you in 2008 in Washington, D.C. at a YREC conference.
Was it true?
Yeah, it was
Okay,
true.
good.
But the follow-up was, do you believe in clean coal?
If clean coal means sequestration and zero emissions, yes.
Dan Esty, true or false, you sympathize with students who disrupted the Harvard-Yale football game protesting university investments in fossil fuels.
True.
True or false, Andy Karsner, your alma mater, Rice University, should divest from fossil fuels.
Well, I don't know how much they've got. Boy.
University divestment, a good thing, yes or no?
I don't feel equipped to say. I don't know.
True or false, Andy Karsner, fossil...
Not if it deprives kids of education who will be solving these problems. I need to understand...
You know, I asked that of Lisa Jackson one time, and no, it was actually someone in the audience asked Lisa Jackson, should Tulane, her alma mater, divest? And Lisa said, actually, I went to Tulane on a scholarship from Shell Oil.
That's what I think.
So I don't think that... And you can argue whether her education, what Lisa has done since that...
Yeah.
You know, that education.
My view, just to be clear on that, my view would be close to what Dan's is. Not everybody jumps the broom at the same time, right? So if Harvard or Stanford can afford that in their endowment and get away with it and send a signal, I think that's great. If MIT can convert the oil industry to having a carbon price or cap and trade, I think that's great. This is not all going to happen at once, and we're going to have to let things happen in gradients.
And I am also a favor of having these institutions...
So much for one word.
Yeah. Well,
have these institutions invest in solutions companies as much as divest from problem companies. And I think to engage with those that can make a difference, steer them towards becoming solution providers.
Dan Esty, true or false, fossil fuel companies that fund university research exert influence over that research?
Oh, I'm sure that is true.
Also, Dan Esty, true or false, without a magical breakthrough in technology, most fossil fuels on the balance sheets of investor and state-owned companies cannot be burned and maintain civilization as we know it.
I lost track of the question there
Yes,
somewhere along the line.
That was a complicated one. Is there unburnable carbon on the balance sheet of fossil fuel companies today?
Almost certainly, yes.
The valuation of those stocks is based on carbon.
Is inflated by their holding these reserves, which they're not in any relevant time frame going to be able to take advantage of.
Andy Karsner, true or false, you sometimes feel guilty about the privilege you've had as a white American man.
I think that's probably true.
Dan Esty, most Americans don't know a scientist, let alone a climate scientist.
Oh, that's for sure true.
Also for Dan, the World Economic Forum in Davos features billionaires lecturing millionaires about curbing poverty.
Closer to true than you would want to believe.
Unequivocally true.
Andy Karsner, most elected Republicans in Washington, D.C. are climate cowards.
True.
I'm going to mention one phrase, and you mentioned the first thing that comes to your mind. Andy Karsner, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say hydrogen cars, hydrogen-powered cars?
Insufficient scale.
Daniel Esty, EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler. You used to work at the EPA. EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler.
Not so good.
Also, Dan Esty, Trump's 2020 budget that proposes 26% cut in U.S. EPA's funding.
Ridiculous and will not proceed.
Also for Dan, cellular protein, also known as lab meat.
Needs work.
Last one, Andy Karsner, what comes to mind when I say blue-collar boom?
My dad's career, but blue-collar boom, education.
Let's give a round of applause for them getting through the...
Well done.
Visions of Indiana Jones getting through the gauntlet there. We're going to invite you to join us with, we have a few moments for questions here with microphone in the back. You can briefly identify yourself with a brief comment or question. If you need help keeping it brief, I'm here for you. And we'll get through as many as we can, so please briefly identify yourself. Welcome to Climate One.
Thank you. Hi, Sam Adams with Road Asset Management. Hi, Dan. Good to see you again. Really great comments, guys. I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of what our other tools for us in the room have. The political dimension is pretty frustrating, even in this election year, even more so in this election year. So what can we do with our capital vote? What is our influence as investors and as consumers, how we save money and how we spend money, and is that going to move the needle?
Dan Esty.
So I would say we've talked a lot about how the role of businesses changed from the 20th century, where it was seen as the problem every day and all day, to being part of the solution, particularly as we want to bring innovation to bear. I think the role of individuals is dramatically transformed in the 21st century. Again, in the 20th century, people thought of themselves in environmental mode as voters. In the 21st century, I think we first have to think of each of us as consumers. So what we buy every day signals to the market what to produce, and it determines our own footprints in our own lives. So very important. Number two, every one of us, I hope every one of us, is thinking about their role as investors. And I think as investors, we have the opportunity, again, to steer portfolio advisors, financial world broadly, toward more sustainable companies, and to insist that we get the data we need to understand which companies are real when it comes to the transition to a sustainable future. And we said it briefly here, but third role of all of us as individuals is as watchdogs. Everyone carrying a smartphone is going to be able to take a picture, I hope not of me doing whatever it was I was being told I might be doing, but I think it's fair and appropriate to keep track of who's pushing things in the right direction, who's pulling things back.
Next question, welcome.
Hi, it's Peter Yallis, former student of Dan Esty, and I want to know for the investors and entrepreneurs here in San Francisco, where do you see the tech solutions occurring in the future? What's going to be needed? And would you make a distinction in investment opportunities between prevention and mitigation of climate change versus adaptation, which maybe you leave to government?
So when I was a negotiator back in the 1992 timeframe, mitigation was the only thing we were allowed to talk about. We were forbidden from talking about adaptation because people thought it was giving up. Adaptation, of course, now is part of the agenda. I think we're also going to have to add to the mix a whole set of new agenda items, including geoengineering, carbon, not just capture and sequestration, but we're going to have to really think about how to make our society carbon negative potentially at some point. And all of that argues, I think, for keeping a wide open mind about where innovation is going to come from. And I would push for us to put a lot of sort of chips on the table and a lot of people innovating in different directions. One of the things I learned as a commissioner of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection in Connecticut is you don't want to guess where breakthroughs are going to come. You want to let a lot of people try different things. And I think that remains essential in terms of the tech world and more broadly our spirit of innovation across the country.
Next question, welcome.
Hi, I'm Barbara Grady. I work with Ceres, although this question isn't on behalf of my employer, but I'm just curious your thoughts on carbon pricing as a potential kind of bipartisan approach to, or market-based approach to getting answers that, you know, that are potentially transformative or not from
Andy Karsner?
Yeah, you know, there's a group out there now where James Baker announced with a lot of what I'd say is old school classic Republicans, but included George Shultz. And you know, I was on Shultz's Hoover Task Force that basically produced a tome on what we called a revenue neutral carbon fee. And that is to say, not growing government or growing an agency of government or figuring out what to do with a brand new taxation source, but rather collecting from the intensity of carbon and then immediately redistributing through whatever mechanism, Social Security, something that has automaticity into it and that could reliably withstand political swings and generations. And in that way, you would have what I think is most important, a socially progressive way to collect a fee on carbon, put a premium on things that you don't want, and to alleviate the cost on things that you do want, jobs, income, etc. And so it requires the kind of significant tax reform we had in 1986. I think it was the last time we had significant tax reform. And to look at this holistically and say, Where do we want to place the premiums? Where do we want to alleviate tax burdens on folks? But above all, it's got to have this characteristic of durability, longevity, predictability, and therefore we need something with automaticity that's socially progressive.
Last question, welcome.
Yeah, hi, it's Jan Grigier, and I guess I have expertise in the energy industry, but I'm basically just here as someone who tries to live his values and stay somehow positive in these crazy times we're in. So I have a question for Andy, mostly, because you brought up the issue that the subsidies for green technologies very often go to people who don't really need them. There's another thing that sometimes happens with people who are fairly well off and on the left, which is NIMBYism, shutting down, the first offshore wind farm that's basically been, thrown away now. And the other thing that really pains me is the fact that we can't get transmission lines built. And if you really want to build a zero carbon grid with, it's really hard to do it if you can't bring wind from somewhere. And
So the question's about NIMBYism?
So how do you get at or overcome the NIMBYism that often gets in the way of large solutions?
So I think there used to be a fight about NIMBY, not in my backyard, or should you have it in your backyard? And that fight was settled by banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. And so we've already gone to that extreme, and to some degree the technology community has responded and said, okay, it's not going to be large super-scaled renewables at a distance that require the last mile of a 300-mile transmission line. It's going to be increasingly distributed fortification of these things in an increasingly distributed grid. And so we are finding that, and again, not just the governments, but the utilities themselves are lagging, something that they tried to stave off forever and say, you can't have this, it'll undermine the grid, it'll undermine reliability, I won't be able to live up to my social compact. Turns out it was the big central generators and their lines that are undermining their capacity to deliver. So it's not to say that I'm for it or I'm just okay with the status quo, but it's sort of the realpolitik of where we live. People are not waiting for the change of NIMBYism or banana is waiting for Godot. If we can design the devices on a distributed basis, and I would say we already have, that every device in our homes, in our lives, whether it's our cars, our buses, things in our workplace, is going to be IP addressable, Wi-Fi connected, and either produce, store, or consume energy. That is the reality of where we're going. And so now the big question is, do we have an air traffic control system for all of these things that are proliferating at this rate? Or will maybe Putin be invited to design one for us? Who knows? But we have to do that hard work. That's one of the vexing problems that we're working on at X. How do we deal with this in a way that enables everybody to have empowered access and the fewest amount of layers or conversions between sunshine and their home? But the days of saying it's my super project because I'm going to build a future gen here, and if only I get the last mile, everything will be solved. Those are kind of the arguments that brought down the nuclear industry in a way, of how big, how grand, how many decades to do. We just don't have the decades to have that argument.
Last question.
Sure. TJ Galothier, I was in the Clinton Gore administration. Good to see you, Andy.
You should be up here on stage.
I'm interested in going back to this question about the revenue-neutral carbon tax, because the two of you are in violent agreement on the need to do something, on the need to allow a lot of innovation to happen, not to have the government dictate all the solutions. But you're weak on how to do it. How can we form this broad central coalition, this middle coalition that will actually get legislation through and will send the signals and the incentives? It seems like the revenue-neutral carbon tax that George Shultz has been promoting is that opportunity. It has Republican support and Democratic support. It has the virtues of being able, the result, people may not be aware, the idea is after you collect the taxes, you send all the money back in the form of a check to every person in the country every year. That has a great benefit on income inequality problems that we have. People who are better off, use more energy, create more carbon emissions, and are going to put more money into that fund, and lower income people who are suffering from environmental justice problems will be receiving more. is that a basis for us to really form a coalition that could go someplace?
And to put a point on that, Andy, it's reasonable, but what it doesn't have is campaign funding behind it to protect people who come out in favor of it.
Well, the answer to your question, DJ, is yes. And you know, Ted Halstead has got the group, the Climate Leadership Council.
A little bit of money.
And it's got some money behind it. It's got a diverse, eclectic coalition. It's got, I think, 20 different college Republican clubs across the country and growing, with this young man, Benjamin Backer, running everywhere. He's got the
But the reason
companies.
Elected Republicans won't come out in favor of it because they're afraid of a primary fight, and no one will be there with campaign cash to protect them.
I see. That's a good question. And I've been, as he was saying it, I was thinking about my coward question, because it's not fair and it's not uniform. Now, you know, not all of the Republicans are cowards. Many of them are seeking to figure out the way to percolate a solution and navigate this. They can't do that if they don't have a job or if they give up their spot to a Tea Party or something else. But you're right. Fundamentally, we're undergoing a political transition and shift that is unprecedented for the country. And I would say you are only seeing the manifestations of that on the Republican side because of how extreme the situation is with the president. We're going to see that. You're seeing that in the Democratic primaries right now. And the question is, in this radical centrist diaspora, you know, where are the leaders going to arise? Because they're out there, and if they can find their districts and toeholds, I think in 2021 you'll hear from them.
We got to wrap this up so Dan can, after the reception, after we close out the radio program, Dan will be out there signing books. I encourage you to go see him out there. I'd like to thank the Climate One crew. I get to sit up here with these fabulous, amazing people, but the Climate One crew really makes this happen. Let's give a thanks to Billy, Brian, Chelsea, Justin, Nina, Sarah, Catherine, Spencer, Stephen, Eiler. I'm Greg Dalton, and we've been talking about big ideas for tackling the climate challenge, and decarbonizing the global economy involves big change at high speed in technology, markets, regulation, culture, investment, politics, and more. Energy is embedded in everything we do and touch every day, and we need to get the carbon pollution out and fast. Our guests today were Daniel Esty, professor at Yale's School of Forestry and Law School. He's editor of the new book, A Better Planet, 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. And Andy Karsner, former official in the Department of Energy under the second President Bush and senior strategist at X, the Moonshot Factory affiliated with Google. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you podcast. Please give us a rating to get more people talking about climate. It really helps. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time, everybody. Fabulous. Thanks. That was a lot of fun.
Great job.
Great job. Let's go back and get our mics off.